Now we would like to welcome our next two presenters, Dr. Caroline Giroux and Dr. Andres Sciolla. Dr. Giroux is a professor of psychiatry at UC Davis and a psychiatrist who specializes in the assessment and treatment of trauma-related conditions. Dr. Sciolla is a professor of clinical psychiatry at UC Davis and focuses on enhancing resilience and individuals and communities to offset effects of exposure to social disadvantage and toxic stress across the lifespan. Dr. Giroux and Dr. Sciolla both founded and co-directed Restart at UC Davis together, a resilience-focused, mindfulness-based stress reduction program for survivors of developmental trauma. They will be presenting on interventions and trauma treatment for Afghan refugees. Dr. Sciolla, it's the floor.
Good morning, everyone, or is it good afternoon, I guess. Thank you very much for inviting us. It's a pleasure to see so many old friends and new friends. And Dr. Giroux and I will talk to you about this topic from a lens of meaning, strengths, and resilience. So our learning objectives are here. We want to, for you at the end of the presentation, to be able to explain how trauma-informed approaches can be relevant to the diagnosis and treatment of trauma-related conditions in Afghan children. Discuss how resilience from a social ecological perspective can address trauma at multiple levels, and we'll go over that, of course, in detail. Name the 4 pillars of meaning and describe 2 ways in which storytelling may give a positive meaning to adversity. So this image is a metaphor for toxic stress, a tree and an axe that can cut some branches. So I want to use this image to talk with you about the effect of trauma and toxic stress in an adult, as if it was a cut far away from the trunk in the small branches. And the consequence of that can be barely noticeable, if you will. We have now youth toxic stress, and we can see how the consequence of that, cutting a branch closer to the trunk, can be more important and sizable, if you will. And then we have childhood toxic stress. And as you can see in this metaphor again, the consequences can be radical, can be altered. So the idea behind this is that toxic stress that happens at a certain point in the development can be so much more life transforming and sending an individual in a different trajectory. So we talk about in the field of 3 kinds of stress, because stress can be good. So on the top, you have positive stress that are brief increases in heart rate and mild elevations of stress hormones. And this, in fact, can build resilience. It's a good thing. So that's how, for example, we venture outside a comfort zone and we become stronger and we mature as we expose ourselves to tolerable kinds of stress, if you will. Now, the next level is tolerable. This is significant stressor. Something bad has happened. But for a child, at least, you have the supportive relationships that help the child go through that without necessarily major consequences. In fact, could be also build resilience over time. So you can be a survivor of a traumatic event, but still become stronger as a result of that. Then we have toxic stress, when you have an activation of the stress response system and you don't have buffering for that. We want to emphasize that positive stress can be good for the brain of all of us, especially in the child that is developing what is called the learning brain, corresponding to the prefrontal cortex. And this here in this image, you can see, oh, how fancy. Okay. So the survival brain is deep inside of the brain in the structures, including the so-called amygdala, which is one of the major centers of detecting threat and responding to that. But importantly, we have here this powerful inhibition of the prefrontal cortex, the learning brain, over the survival brain. And then we have these behaviors that are possible because of this balance, like emotional regulation, long attention span, persistence, the ability to have grit, as they call it, impulse control, planning and problem solving, self-monitoring, self-awareness, accurate mind reading. When I mean by that, with accurate mind reading, of course, we cannot read minds, but we can read intentions or guess intentions. And that can be more or less accurate. And survivors of childhood trauma very often make errors. And this has been researched with neuroimaging and the ability to recognize facial expressions, for example. And survivors of childhood trauma can misread expressions of anger and fear, for example. So when we have toxic stress, the balance between these two structures, major structures, changes, and there's a weak inhibition. So the survival brain overdevelops for survival purposes. So this is good, if you will. This is how nature, Mother Nature wanted us to function, that we have the ability to switch gears and give precedence to the development of these structures in the brain, because we need that for survival purposes. And we can postpone the development of the other structures that require a lot of energy and time. So there's a balance that results in behaviors that can be there, as many people may have heard these are solutions. These behaviors are solutions for the problem of toxic stress in the childhood. However, when we grow up as adults, it makes it very difficult to navigate the social world if we have emotional dysregulation, short attention span, giving up easily, impulsivity, short-term planning, survival mode, we don't see the future, or we discount the future and the consequences, poor self-awareness, inaccurate mind reading. So these behaviors can be seen in survivors of trauma, and when we don't pay attention to where they come from, they can naturally, and when I emphasize that it's normal, we can, especially when we're talking about with adults with these kind of behaviors, we feel impatient, frustrated, and I'm talking about physicians. We used to call these challenging patients, when they in fact are challenging behaviors, not patients. But we take it personally and we think, why on earth are they doing this? And I'm not considering this case social determinants of health that can make the picture even more complicated, if you will, because people may not adhere to treatment recommendations because of barriers to transportation, for example, or access to healthcare for other reasons. But there also can be behaviors that lead to these difficult behaviors. And this could, of course, be anybody who's interacting with survivor trauma. Could be a social worker or someone in a community-based organization trying to help survivors of trauma. So what happens then is that this toxic stress gets embedded biologically, becomes part of our functioning. And we talk about one way of summarizing the impact of the chronic childhood toxic stress on the body over time is this premature aging, this wear and tear of the body that is quantified in this measure called allostatic load. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but just to explain to you in this graphic, what's happening is that normally when we have stress, we have this picture of hormonal release, cortisol and other hormones of stress that prepare the body for flight or flight. And then when the stress is over, you have hormonal shut off. However, in chronic stress and toxic stress, you have no hormone shut off. And so this chronic accumulation produces this wear and tear and this allostatic load. So this is the graph. It's just to summarize that there's been an exponential growth in the amount of data we have about adverse childhood experiences and what happens. Remember that image of the tree with the axe when we cut a branch close to the trunk, which is can be devastating. The earlier, the more devastating that problems. So how do we generally approach in services, social services and healthcare, how do we approach this picture of childhood toxic stress and the behavioral legacy, if you will, of this, with the principles of trauma-informed care? These are listed here, and I will go over in the next slide with a little bit more care, because the other one was a little bit too busy. But to highlight, I think that all can read from the back, safety includes, of course, emotional, psychological, and physical safety. And that's determined by everybody in the team, not only the patient or the client, but also we need to feel safe when we do our work. Trustworthiness and transparency, very important that we show all our cards, if you will. We are not, imagine that trauma very often involves the violation of trust with caregivers. So we may develop a keen sense of distrust. So it's very important to make up for that, to be very mindful and careful about building trust. We have peer support that is proven time and again that is very important, and utilizing the stories and the lived experiences of survivors of trauma. Collaboration and mutuality, very important too. Empowerment, voice and choice, and the consideration of culture, gender issues, and historical, like in case of historical trauma. So let's switch gears now to talk about resilience. Resilience can be understood in more than one way. So here we have at the top what Wikipedia would say, which is a more traditional understanding of resilience as an individual quality, something that we have or not have. Now, the more progressive view of this is actually a process of adapting well in the face of adversity. And last, even more contemporary definition of resilience as a capacity of a system, not only an individual or a group, but a system. And we'll take a look at that in a graph to be able to function well and survive and progress a long time. So in this graph, the figure places the individual resilience within overlapping domains of resilience. It's not only an individual, but it's an individual interacting with several levels of resilience. And that the figure also recognizes that each domain is interacting and perhaps even subtracting from another one. So we can simplify this as 4 interacting systems, highly interactive. So this is not like a Russian doll, if you will, in which you have multiple dolls encapsulating each other but not communicating. This is a dynamic process in which individual household have one level, then the extended family and neighborhood, then the community, and then a larger level of society and structural determinants of health and resilience. So the interactions between these domains is what will make a difference. So to finish my section, and give transition to Dr. Giroux, is with this quote that is a little complex to take it all in because it seems contradictory. But let me read it to you and briefly analyze that. Whereas asking a child whether she has a hobby would be insensitive in context of extreme poverty or war, it would also be inappropriate to expect child labor to produce psychological benefits in a high-income country where values place on education rather than the child's financial contribution to her family. So, in other words, we would be, if we were to say to a child in a rich industrialist country like this, why aren't you school and you're working, that would be very inappropriate in the context, appropriate in the context, but the same thing could be changed completely, same scenario, in an impoverished country or setting in war or with severe conflict, in which a child may feel that is contributing, feel good about themselves because of their working and helping the family. So we cannot judge that in the same way. So in both cases, protective processes, that is to say resilience, reflect the context and the availability of resources for that individual in that context. So Dr. Giroux, would you please come here? And I don't know if you want to hold the microphone too.
Okay. So we had a nice start, and I'm going to expand a little bit on those concepts that Dr. Sciolla presented. Okay, so when we talk about trauma-informed care, we assume that we recognize some manifestations at a macro level. So Dr. Sciolla talked about what's happening in the body, so at the micro level, but at the macro level, what does it look like? So if you interact with someone who seems agitated or who seems to be zoning out, I think it might be helpful to wonder if they're experiencing a trauma response. And a trauma response would be any of the 4 Fs, okay? The fight, flight, the freeze, or the fawn, or also called faint. So these are actually beautifully designed to protect us, right? But when trauma has not been processed or healed properly, these reactions tend to recur, and when patients are triggered. So, for instance, fight or flight can happen when people have the possibility to fight back, or flight if there's a perpetrator or a threat. Freezing response is the next option. Okay, I can't run away, I can't fight. What's left? Taking leave of the body, literally, right? People dissociate, people often recall the abuse, saying, I was floating above myself, when this happened. It's a protective mechanism because the stress is so intense and severe and overwhelming that the body needs a break, or the spirit. And really, there is that separation between mind and body that we see after trauma. And then fawn or faint, that's kind of the extreme, but it can also be in relationships. Think about it, like people pleasers, they basically erase themselves to just prioritize other people's needs. So it's kind of a way of, psychological fainting. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog is a wonderful book. Trigger warning, there are a lot of difficult stories there. But what I liked so much about this book is the author's approach. And some stories end well. So it gave me a lot of hope about trauma healing. And in this book, I became familiar with the neurosequential model, which was developed by Dr. Perry, the author. And I had never heard of that. And I thought that was very interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about it. For instance, let's go back to the 4 Fs. In children, I don't know if you have encountered children coming to your work with a list of labels. I certainly have. And to me, it's like mind-boggling. How can a kid have ADD, ODD, anxiety, explosive disorder, bipolar, etc.? I mean, there is usually one unifying diagnosis, right? Adding those labels doesn't help. So is it possible that actually they are enacting any of the 4Fs, if not all. A child who's oppositional or defiant might be trying to fight back a perceived threat. A child who's not learning well in school, who seems inattentive, might just be dissociated because of triggers. So it's important to decode any manifestation that children have, including refugees, immigrants who might have gone through trauma pre-migration, and that's why they're refugees. Also during the migration, if they were at the refugee camp, and after that, post-migration, because of the shock of cultures. So what is the neurosequential model? Basically, it's thinking about the brain developing sequentially in layers, okay, with the brain stem being first, then the midbrain, then limbic system, then the cortical regions, okay, so that develop later in adolescence throughout adulthood. So what's important to do with that is to determine the developmental age at which the trauma occurred to see where the person is developmentally stuck. And then we just meet the patient or the person where they're at and try to stimulate those brain regions that need to finish their development. So if we go at the beginning, let's say there's a trauma that happened in infancy. What do babies need? Intuitively, we like to rock babies, we make them jump on our knees. There's a rhythmicity. Well, that's what the brainstem is about, regulating basic functions, biorhythms. At the end of that spectrum, the cortical areas would involve things like abstract thinking, socialization, learning, etc., which the teenagers will develop. Also the sense of self, etc., identity, self-esteem. So then there will be approaches targeted at those brain regions. So we are very resilience-based, Dr. Sciolla and I, and I'm sure everyone here interested in those presentations. We definitely are determined to make things better or help people become self-healers so they can have a thriving life. So I appreciate your interest, and I feel like this is how we can basically have a paradigm shift, right? So we have to, in this book, Upside, which I recommend, about post-traumatic growth, the author invites us to view suffering as an accomplishment. So basically not looking at trauma as a pathology with the 4Fs. We're really good at that. If you're healthcare workers, we identify the problem. No, but we also have to look at the human potential. What would this person be able to express because of that trauma? What would it bring to light in that person's life? Recently, I had I'm part of a meeting it's called Inside Out Group, and we meet via Zoom. And it's very intellectual, existential, philosophical. And one of the quotes that the leader sent was about rejection. Rejection is not fun. Nobody likes to be rejected. In fact, it just wounds our need to be loved. It's a universal need, right? To be accepted and be loved. So being rejected is actually a deep injury. But he invited us, and the person who wrote the quote, invited us to actually view rejection as a gift. Because what does rejection does is it forces us to reconnect with our authenticity. And sometimes when we're rejected or we have a major trauma, an accident, we might be isolated. But that can also be good because it could be a catalyst to introspection. So the author talks about deliberate rumination. I wouldn't go do too much of that because the brain needs to be reframed with the positive, okay? So we need to also look at the good side that this event has or presents. It could be, oh, wow, it was a wake-up call. I had to reassess my priorities. So in a way, that was not all bad. And then the trauma can allow us to use creative outlets. It forces us to expand, some abilities that we had never expressed before. If we become limited in our function, or if there are things that we can't do anymore, well, what else could we do then, Or we can become advocates for a cause. So experiencing growth in the wake of trauma is incredibly common. Half of more or trauma survivors reported some positive changes, actually. And growth is more common than PTSD. Although, good news also for people who have PTSD is that PTSD is no impediment to growth. In fact, sometimes it takes that extreme for people to say, hey, I am so disconnected from my spirit. Mind and body need to be back together. I like to view trauma or trauma reactions as a disconnection from the divine aspects of our being. When I did a refugee trauma certificate program, Dr. Molika introduced the 4 pillars of meaning, which I had never heard of before. And I decided to rename one of them so that they could all start with S, and I call them the overlapping S's because they kind of all overlap in a way. So what are these pillars that allow us to give meaning to difficult life experiences? We have the sense of purpose, sense of belonging, storytelling, and spirituality or transcendence. What is the sense of purpose? A reason to get out of bed every day. It also gives a sense of contributing to a cause bigger than oneself. It might need to be revised or reshaped because of the trauma, right? Because after a trauma, there's a fracture in the timeline, in one's life narrative. We change, we transform. That's inevitable. We can't go back to the former self. And in a way, it's a good thing. We are better versions of ourselves. Ikigai is also an interesting exercise. If you want to do that, I won't go into details, but you can Google that. It's a Japanese, I would say, framework to find the right activity that will be balanced and bring you meaning. Sense of belonging. We are social creatures. Like I mentioned, we have a universal need to be accepted, feel lovable and worthy. And being part of community, whether it's a religious group or book club or classroom, whatever, sports team, it helps us break our aloneness by connecting and identifying with others with similar stories and struggles. And Dr. Sciolla and I will lead groups for trauma survivors, and we can, confirm that. And sometimes it becomes a chosen family for these groups who have difficulties with their blood relatives. So find your tribe if you feel alone. There are people like you. Whatever we have experienced as emotions, other people before us have, and others might be also simultaneously. I'm passionate about storytelling because sharing your story allows you to restore wholeness. And it also allows us to bring stories together, which is necessary to raise awareness and educate society. There are many ways and formats to do storytelling. We don't have to write, but we can use oral storytelling or even play. So think about children who have experienced trauma. They could reenact the trauma using a dollhouse or something with, little characters and dolls. In the book Upside, expressive writing, one of the advantages of that is it's not contingent upon a listener. So you don't have to share that with anyone. You don't have to fear invalidation or critique. And it's important to focus on the emotional experience more than the facts in order to heal. And there was an interesting study by Penn Baker. People who wrote about the emotions reported more significant changes in their lives. And a study with med students, one group was to write about emotions, the other about neutral elements. And the group that wrote about their emotions post-trauma, their antibody titers were actually higher than the control group after a vaccine. So it does affect our immune system even. So we engage in storytelling to reclaim parts of our lives that were taken by trauma, to integrate trauma into one's broader life narrative, which kind of help find meaning to it and make sense of this complex experience. We can also edit and create a new story, and we can say, well, this is how I would have liked the outcome to be, and also try to focus on creating positive memories starting in the now and being in the now, in the present moment. It's also a great mindfulness exercise because it forces us to pause. When we tell a story, we pay attention to each word and each description. and it helps bring closure and transcend an event. How many people will say, I felt so good talking to you about this, right? Spirituality and transcendence consist of embracing and living by core values such as gratitude. I believe that abundance is inside of us, and once we can realize that, we have gratitude, and when we feel grateful, then it's easier to transcend trauma. So spirituality could consist also of cultivation of kindness, awe, joy, and beauty. Practicing it, expressing it, but also noticing that in others. And connection with nature and being attuned to its cycles allows us also to transcend. And by the way, I wanted to say about the flickering initially, what was going on. I had a thought. Empaths, like people who are empathetic, apparently, and I'm consider myself an empath, apparently we have, and all people in this room, because that's the flickering actually might be the proof of that, our vibes might interfere with technology. So actually it was a really good sign that, there was some technological issue early on. We just need to protect our energies, when we're empaths. We just need to be more aware of that because we're easily attuned to the suffering of others. And to continue on Dr. Sciolla's tree metaphor, now the positive side of that is like there's a tree of contemplative practices that can help our healing, right? So, and then there's no limit, right? There's a full menu here, thinking about labyrinth walking, which kind of replicates an internal self-reflective process when we go deep down inside of ourselves, but also we have to emerge back, transform, so we get out of the labyrinth. But doing that also in real life can also kind of help the brain do its own process. Cultivating creative activities, loving kindness, meditation, any other form of art or advocacy, activism, marches, etc. So I hope now that you're convinced that we can go from the 4 F's of trauma responses to the 4 S of pillars of meaning to self-compassion and ultimately healing. Beth Moore said, I am better off healed than I ever was unbroken. Thank you very much for your patience and attention, and we can answer questions, Dr. Sciolla.
Dr. Giroux and Dr. Sciolla, we're so thankful for your participation. I personally learn a lot every time I talk and meet with you, and you kind of so beautifully put it, visualize it, the hormones, the brain, the resilience, the purpose. So if you have any question, I have a lot of questions, but I want to give the chance to you. If you guys have any question, I can bring the mic to you. And they have decades of experience and trauma and helping people. Dr. Goga, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giroux, Dr. Sciolla. I wanted to ask you about the metrics for resilience. Our colleague, Dr. Kaisa Lemi, shared with me his frustration with using Connor-Davidson resilience scale. Didn't work too well with the Afghans. The scoping review that we conducted looked into, I conducted with my students, looked into scales, resilience scales for others, like, collectivistic societies or relational self. We could not find instruments for that. Connor-Davidson seems to be, ubiquitous. Now, you presented a beautiful ecological model of 4 S's. Have you thought of developing a resilience scale where you basically use indicators on those 4 S's and quantify them, somehow create a composite score that would, resonate with, a lot of people? I was thinking, you mentioned post-traumatic growth. Jalaluddin Rumi, another refugee colleague, mentioned with pride, Rumi. Rumi talks about the broken vessel, the trauma that is a gate through which the light gets in the darkness. And so you're better healed and broken and healed than before. So it would be beautiful to develop such a resilience scale. Have you thought of that?
Let's do it. So, to the best of my knowledge, no, that hasn't been applied, that model, into kind of a measurement. That work remains to be done. As you pointed out, this resilience concept was developed in industrialized, individualistic societies that have a very limited sense of community and the collective. So, the rest of the world has to come up with a new measure for that. So thank you for the question.
Any other question?
Just wanted to share with you more of a comment than a question, how much I appreciate all the presentations, but this one with a focus on resilience. Just myself personally, I'm a refugee from Bosnia too, and it just makes so much sense, the 4 S's. And in my personal life, as well as I'm a clinician as well, and have worked with refugees and immigrants for many years, and it just makes so much sense. And I just love the focus on resilience and celebrating rather than pathologizing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment. Congratulations on your journey.
Any other question? Reflection?
I have to leave.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'll be available. I'll be around for the next 45 minutes or so. So, chat with me.
I'm so fascinated by your presentation. And I was wondering your thoughts on individual versus collective were so used, and I argued against American individualism or European, self-centered versus Afghan collective. And yet, when you look all the post-traumatic growth stories, including, the Sufis are the example of post-traumatic stories. You listen to the life of this and the life of that, Hazrat Yusuf, and so many other, basically Sufi masters that talk about going down and coming up, transformation, and they teach, those teachings can be put. So how is it, when you look at post-traumatic growth, that within collectivistic cultures, the model seems to be Joseph Campbell's hero's, journey. Whether it's this culture or the other culture, it seems to you use that universal pattern.
No, I agree. I think it takes a lot of collective aspect to healing. Just think about the pandemic, right? It was a collective trauma, but I think even individual trauma, there needs to be a collective aspect to it. I mentioned a little bit the divine. I'm really interested in that. It's my own spiritual belief and conceptualization of the meaning of life, but I believe that we're part of this big fabric on a deeper level. And when we have trauma, we become cut from that. We lose touch with the divine, or we could call it the light, the collective unconscious, whatever, or collective soul. And what do we do to bring back that soul or those soulish elements? Well, there are the 4 S's. They're really like resources in all of us that are waiting to be expressed. I don't know if that answers your question, Dr. Koga.
Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure whether I'm addressing this question to you or to our Afghan colleagues, but I'm really interested in your reflections on how we could bring this quality of spirituality and the divine into our work with clients, Afghan clients. Personally, I do come from also a Sufi background, but I'm not sure how culturally sensitive it would be to bring that in, or how that would work with our professional boundaries. If anyone has a reflection on that, I would love to hear it.
Well, I can try to share what I know, what I've noticed, but a lot of the trauma recovery consists of re-inhabiting one's body. It might sound weird, like body, it's not spiritual. No, it is. In fact, Deepak Chopra wrote a book called, he said we are basically embodied souls. We're not, creatures that have a soul, So I think it's a core element, but we have, the body is like a bridge, right, between a dimension that I call divine or intangible and a material dimension, So maybe examining the person's spiritual beliefs, but we all have a body, so that's a fact, that's universal. So we could say, like, let's do grounding exercises. How are you going to go back into your body? It's by using the senses. And how do we do that? Doing mindfulness, being aware of what's going on around us. And then when we do that more and more, we realize that all there is total awareness, right? And this follows us all the time. So, it applies to everyone. And some people will use prayer to achieve that state of mindfulness, or repeating positive mantras. But going back to the body, that's what's important. Being like in touch with the divine, but in our body. Being anchored and grounded.
Yeah. Last question before we head to lunch. Did you?
Sadeep, can I just respond
please,
to her comment?
Yeah.
I think, I think it's important to recognize that the majority of Afghan refugees are Muslim. And so as clinical providers, in addition to kind of really thinking about the spirituality, like grounding the spirituality in a better understanding of Islam, I think will go a long way in the type of care you're able to provide. I don't think you need to have that conversation directly, but Muslims pray 5 times a day. And most newly arrived Afghan refugees are going to be more religious and will be praying 5 times a day. So how do you speak about spirituality from the perspective of prayer and Muslims submitting to God 5 times a day? How do you talk about faith and bring faith into the conversation? And I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to faith-based organizations. There's very active mosques. There's very active imams in the Sacramento area. So if you're not comfortable sort of talking about those things, find community experts that you can refer your patients out to. So there's a very vibrant Muslim community in the Sacramento area, and we have to find ways to better connect our refugee populations into those social networks.
If I may add, you can also do cognitive reframing of the trauma in the sense, for example, a refugee is in the darkest pit, and you remind the Afghan refugee of Hazrat Yusuf that has been thrown in the well, only to use it as a springboard for a higher growth. So if there is faith in God, in Allah, and in the largest, scheme of things of the universe, then you gain control again over the situation, and you trust basically God. So that's one thing. 101 for Persians was to include Masnavi in cognitive behavioral therapy. So I had a student, Iranian student. I was a doctoral dissertation advisor. She introduced Masnavi and made CBT more palatable to Iranians and probably Afghans.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to quickly share. We've developed a 40-hour, it used to be 16, now it's gone, 32 to 40-hour training where we use the concept of peer support and then aligning that with Islamic values to be able to help anyone who's who's a refugee and who's gone through these challenges in order to be able to see where they come from, acknowledge and learning about that. And then we also Within that training, we talk about trauma-informed care, how to work with refugees, acknowledging the LGBT community, the Afghan Muslim community, and we've recently added a youth component. And this is where responding, trying to it's called Shifa training, which Shifa means healing. Shifa for Today training, where we are able to teach you how to work with refugees, given their vast backgrounds and the experiences and what they've been through.
Thank you, Gulshan. I know we are already 3 minutes into lunch break, but we're going to have one last question, a quick question because she waited so long, Dr. Giroux, please.
Of course. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Migdalia Wade with the Department of Social Services. And I was just wondering, right, in this whole conversation about shifting, what I'm hearing from this last presentation is that not only do we recognize trauma, right? Not only are we being trauma-informed, but I think I see a shift here from being trauma-informed or trauma-focused to healing-focused. My question to you is: are there any resources specific to policymakers, right? So that we may use those resources to guide our own program guidelines, to guide our own program designs, and to guide how it is that we fund those service provider partners that we have out there. That would be very helpful, right? In addition to all this wonderful science and these great studies that you have here, which is, they're priceless, adding another layer to that, somewhere between the science, the practitioner, and then the policymaker, somewhere in between, because we are, in a way, in a place to be a conduit for some of that service.
Beautifully said. Thank you for your comment. And
Sure.
unfortunately, I don't know resources, but that's definitely shows that it's an emerging field, an area of development, and there is a gradual shift happening. We go from being pathological or focusing on the negative to now finally looking at the strength. So it is happening. But if I'm becoming aware of resources, I will certainly share that. But I don't know if anyone has, but you have. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think a major resource, Migdalia, is the one you're probably already aware of, the California Reducing Disparities Project, which Office of Health Equity within the Department of Public Health, and one of the grantees. So what they did basically, just to make it really quickly, funded 35 underserved communities to be able to define a practice that works for them. So for us, MASF, it's been peer support. But when you look at the other entities, ethnicities, African American, Latin community, LGBT community, they've all developed a practice and basically basing it from strength-based and moving towards healing. And of course, acknowledging trauma within that. So that happened for 4 years, and now it's happening for another 4 years, and we're planning for another 4 years after 2026. So I think that from what they've developed and the findings they have, because there was a huge evaluation component in it, I think that would be very useful for policy changes.
Dr. Giroux, thank you so much.
Thank you so
We really
much.
appreciate it.